to share with you what Warren Wiersbe has to say about chapter 2 of Revelation. In chapters 2 and 3, he says, Christ deals with the seven churches. As he stands in their midst, he examines their spiritual condition with his eyes of fire. He is doing this today. It doesn't matter what men or denominations think of a church. The point is, what does Jesus Christ think of it? We should note that the different elements of the description of Christ in verses 13 through 16 are repeated in the letters to the seven churches. Revelation chapter 1, verses 13 through 16 gives this description. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like wool, like snow. His eyes were a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So these descriptions, this description is repeated in the 7 letters. That attribute of Christ that applied to the particular needs of the church is emphasized in the message. The danger to the churches is that Christ would remove their testimony. He would rather have a city in the darkness than to have a lampstand out of his divine will. Much of the symbolism of this chapter will be repeated later in the book. It cannot be emphasized too much that you trace your cross references as you study the book of Revelation. The 7 churches of Asia Minor. If Revelation chapter 1 verse 19 is the inspired outline of the book, and that says, write therefore the things that you have seen, those things that are, and those things that are to take place after this. If that's the outline of the book, then Revelation chapter 2 and 3 deals with the things which are. In other words, Christ selected 7 churches out of the many in Asia Minor in order to get across his specific message. Certainly there were sins in the other churches, but the matters discussed in these 7 churches cover all possible circumstances. Christ selected these 7 churches to illustrate the spiritual conditions possible in the churches until he returns. Some students believe these churches also illustrate the prophetic history of the church from apostolic times until the end of the age. Ephesus was the church of apostolic times, starting to lose that first love for Christ. Smyrna was the persecuted church of the first centuries. Pergamos was the church joined to Rome, the state church. Thyatira represented the dominance of Roman Catholicism. Sardis symbolized the Reformation Church. Philadelphia, brotherly love, the missionary church of the last days. And Laodicea was the lukewarm, apostate church of the last days. However, keep in mind that all of the conditions named were present in the churches at that one time, and they are all present with us today. Furthermore, if this is a sequence of prophetic history of the church, then Jesus could not return for his people until the era of the Laodicean church. and this would make his imminent return impossible. While the seven churches may illustrate the general development of the church through the ages, that was not the main purpose for the seven letters. Note that a special word is spoken to the overcomers in each church. These overcomers are not the super saints in each church, a special group that will receive special privileges from Christ, but the true believers in each of these churches. We dare not assume that every member of every local church in every period of history is a true child of God. Those who truly belong to Christ are overcomers. Listen to 1 John chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? In every period of history, there have been true saints in the professing church, often called the invisible church. Christ speaks a special word of encouragement to them, and certainly we may apply these words of encouragement to ourselves today. Note, too, that Satan is mentioned in connection with four churches. He causes the persecution at Smyrna in chapter 2, verse 9. He has his throne or his seat at Pergamos in chapter 2, verse 13. He teaches his deep doctrines at Thyatira in chapter 2, verse 24. And he uses his synagogue or gathering of false Christians to oppose the soul-winning efforts at Philadelphia. And that's going to be in chapter 3, verse 9. Christ points out several dangers in these churches. A, the Nicolaitans, and that's in chapter 2, verse 16 and verse 15. The name Nicholas means conquer the people and suggests a separation of clergy and laity in the churches. This sin began as deeds in Ephesus in verse 6, but the deeds became doctrine in Pergamos. So it goes, deceivers introduce false activities into the church, and before long, these activities are accepted and encouraged. B, Satan's synagogue in chapter 2, verse 9 and chapter 3, verse 9. Jesus says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This refers to assemblies of people who claim to be believers, but are really children of the devil. John chapter 8 and verse 44 says, Jesus is speaking, saying, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And he's speaking to religious people there. The word synagogue simply means to bring together, and it is an assembly of religious people. Satan then has a church. As a side note, we cannot assume that every gathered group of people calling themselves believers are actually the synagogue of God. But some people get that are brought together is an assembly of religious people that is a synagogue of Satan. Let's talk about that. The doctrine of Balaam is another danger that happens in the church. And you can read about Balaam in Numbers chapter 22 through 25. Balaam led Israel into sin by telling them that because they were God's covenant people, they could mix with the heathen and not be judged. Balaam could not curse them himself, but he could tempt them with the women of Moab and with sins of the flesh. This doctrine, then, is the idea that the church can be married to the world and still serve God. That's called the doctrine of Balaam. And another danger was Jezebel. In chapter 2, verse 20, Jesus says, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols." So you can read about the literal Jezebel in 1 Kings 16 through 2 Kings chapter 10. Jezebel was the heathen wife of King Ahab, a woman who led Israel into Baal worship. She seduced Israel with her false teaching. Note the spiritual problems in these churches and what Jesus instructed them to do if they were to have his blessing. He told Ephesus, busy working for the Lord, but no sincere love for him. They had a program, but without passion. This is the busy church with the great statistics, but a church drifting away from the heartfelt devotion to Christ. He had a personal message for Smyrna. This church gets no criticism from the Lord, but a danger is still present. This was a poor and suffering church. How easy it would have been to compromise, become rich, and escape persecution. How discouraged they might have been because they were not as rich as the Laodicean church. He had a personal message for the church at Pergamos. This church had members who held the false doctrine that it was easy to profess Christ while living in sin at the same time. So also the people were under the heavy hand of spiritual dictators who promoted themselves and not the Lord. He had a personal message for Thyatira. This woman was out of place in teaching doctrine. Her doctrine led the people into sin, and we must maintain God's order in the church. Listen to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Let's talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, as it pertains to Jezebel at Thyatira. Sardis, he had a personal message for that church also. They had a reputation without the life to back it up. Her best days were behind her. This is the has-been church. A great name in the past, but no ministry today. It is ready to die, but it can receive new life if it will but strengthen what it has. He had a personal message for Philadelphia, the church before the open door, taking the gospel to the world. This is the church that holds the word and honors Christ's name. But Satan's synagogue is not far away, and there is always the danger of compromise. And then Laodicea. the lukewarm church, the apostate church, with a big budget and no blessing. This is the church that is materially rich and spiritually poor. And the tragedy is the people do not know how poor and miserable they really are. Christ stands outside the church, calling for even one believer to yield to him. These are some of the notes from Wiersbe's expository outlines on the New Testament. What did you think about what he had to say about the seven churches of Asia? Let's talk.